What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and I'm here with the Bo Daddy, who has got the gift of prophecy. That's right. The Bo Daddy dances with the Spirit. I've actually have no idea exactly what's going to happen here, Bo.
Well done. I am excited to present this stuff to you and pick your brain. Question, are you in an ice fishing setup?
Oh, yeah. It's 30 degrees in North Carolina this morning, but the sheer enjoyment last week of smoking a cigar while we did TNT, it transformed my weekend. I thought, wow. I just started the weekend at the beginning of the day on Friday. Look, Lori's here. See, she's in Florida, so she could probably walk outside right now, and we could be on our phone while she has her nice cigar. And but Florida, it's a little warmer. It's cold here, and on like following cigar social media people, I discovered like people buy these pop-up ice tents that you use when you go ice fishing because they're made to ventilate well and retain heat. And now you can just use them for your outdoor enjoyment.
This is an amazing development.
Yeah, I want to send you a picture of just what this looks like on the inside.
Unreal.
It's kind of something.
I went ice fishing once when I lived in upstate New York on Lake Saratoga, and because I loved fishing, and somebody invited me ice fishing. It's not exactly the same thing, and from then on, whenever somebody would invite me ice fishing, I would say, no thanks, I don't like drinking that much.
Which is a lie.
Well, back then it wasn't, though.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, ice fishing can often be an excuse for because you got to do something to pass the time, you know, and help keep yourself warm.
Yeah, no, it's there. Do you have your phone?
Yeah.
Okay, look at the picture I just sent you.
All right.
This is the setup for this morning in this ice tent.
Oh no, that is elaborate.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, man. Well done. This is impressive.
But now that I know it's possible, I kind of want to know what the etiquette is of just doing this to random people that don't know this is what they're going to be signing up to while I do interviews, right? Like someone I've never had on the podcast before. They're all excited. Their publisher, sends you the book. They show up, and then I have a hat on and an ice tent smoking. And they're like, what the hell was this? I was like, I don't know. It seemed like a great idea. You know how much more interesting your book is? That's how you know if I really like the book or not.
Yeah.
They're like, he's out in the ice tent. He wasn't that interested.
In fairness, back when we were in LA and we would host rowdy live events, we got a little bit of a reputation for being, and I heard this from somebody else, the bad boys of theology podcasts. And because, we were a little bit rowdy. And but
we can still get rowdy, Bo.
Yeah, but this is a continuation by different means of that sort of unorthodox, irreverent style.
Yeah. I occasionally get emails advising me to change it.
Is that right?
Yeah, there are unsolicited ones, of course. I'm sure they come from great places, and I just think to myself, you sent me an email. Like, and it's always a response to an email. I'm like, 80,000 people got this email, and you responded with a 4 or 5 paragraph free life advice email that's like, some of your jokes are inappropriate. I don't think you should smoke cigars.
Yeah.
You're a parent. It's a bad, you're going to lead them to the use of nicotine. And in my head, I'm like, that's what I'm hoping. I hope that when I hang out with them as adults, they want to smoke cigars and talk about religion and politics like I do with my dad. This is
That is so funny.
but
You know, when a couple weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go. My father had started a podcast. They got one season in before his passing, but they had recorded like 50 some episodes. And his co-host, who was a former mentor,
so they had
of
like
mine,
50 that weren't released. Is that what you're meaning?
I think they only had like 30 out when my dad passed, and they ended up releasing the other 20 after that. And then I got to come on for a zero reset before they started season 2. And it's called the Mentored Podcast. It was great. But I'll tell you something that got edited out is at the end, they gave me a chance to promote, like, where can people find you if they like what you're doing or whatever, where can people find you? And I was listing, places on the interwebs that people could find me. And when I talked about the Theology Nerd Throwdown, I gave a little bit of a summary of what we do. And the production team stopped me and said, hey, I don't know that that's really going to resonate with our audience. Can we redo that and you just leave out the TNT?
It's not going to resonate.
Which is pretty funny because it's not exactly the same crowd, And
you never know. There might be just one of those people just being like, man, if only there was some more hot takes. Like,
yeah.
Where else are those people going to have someone where you're like, oh, I also have these thoughts on a preterist something or another, and I was just like, oh, this is one of those words evangelicals use when they have charts about the end of the world that I don't know. Like, I just know. I mean, I know like pre and post millennial just because that's kind of contained in the word.
Yeah.
But I know there's a set of other words that are connected to the one true biblical interpretation of eschatology that when I hear them, I just learned early on, stop. Don't say anything, Tripp. You're at a Baptist school. These people, this is what I did in undergrad. If they know these words, they aren't going to appreciate your questions. That was my
That's funny.
So now I'm excited that you're going to prophesy for us or something like that. Then preterist, because you could. It sounds kind of like like adjacent to probably a felony, preterist.
Yeah, you're right. It sounds a little risque.
Is it the vision of the eschatology where God would be like most likely interpreted in this narrative as like a gaslighting authoritarian? Because if so, like preterist, there's connections.
You know what's interesting? From time to time, I put together these ABC series where I pick one word that starts with an A, one with a B, one with a C. I put together these ABCs of whether it's contemporary theology or whatever the subject is.
Yeah.
And whenever I get to the P, it's always really challenging because there are so many good theological words that start with P. For instance, I usually go with perichoresis. Right?
Yeah.
That got a stinger.
That's a Trinitarian slam dance.
I was going to say, for a lot of people, it's like the first time they've even considered, the divine dance of the Godhead. But preterist is also a very fun word that we're going to talk about today. But I know that you lean towards prehension.
Ooh, prehension, panpsychism, panentheism, participation, prolepsis. I mean, there's just so many fun P's.
Prolepsis that's a good one.
Yeah, I could just pee this place up. There's a lot of theological P, and I got 2 P's in my name. I don't know how that's connected, but it could be.
Oh my goodness. Hey, do you are you ready to announce where you're having beer camp this year?
I think I
can. Are you still teasing?
I'll tell you. It'll just be between me and you. Because Kristen's going to update the website today.
All right, because I saw another one of those things on Instagram saying stay tuned.
Yeah. Yeah. So I imagine it's going to be revealed at some point today. We're going to Minneapolis.
Oh, that's gonna be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Oh boy, I might have to bring my fishing rod and stay a couple days late.
You know, the see, if you plan ahead, and I'm trying to figure out if I would get in trouble by asking to extend the week I'm setting up for camp and then running it. But can I just extend it 2 days? Because, Brian McLaren and Tony went fishing after last one.
Yeah, they
And I'm
did.
like, maybe I could, like, say, Alicia, this is my spiritual mentorship week with, like, I need to spend some time with
Yeah,
Brian. Like,
yeah.
Brian, do you want to go fishing and call it spiritual formation? So, because if I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna go hang out with, I just want to go hang out with my friends some more. Probably not
Yeah.
gonna, not a good sell.
Well, let's start working on let's find a cabin and after let's go debrief after beer camp. Let's go debrief at a cabin.
Debrief. Yeah. Debrief. If it's work related, it's tax deductible. So this is what I'm talking about, Bo.
Oh boy. Hey, can I tell you a fun story?
Mm-hmm.
So last year in the summer, there was a debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and Joe Biden didn't the optics weren't very good.
Yeah, that's
And
that lack of complete sentences.
oh, it was yeah. So I came up with this plan. And the plan was that if the Democrats won in that fall's election, that we would study the book of Daniel in Bible study.
Uh-huh.
But if the Republicans won, then I would do the book of Daniel from the pulpit. I would preach through the book of Daniel. And
so you wanted Daniel either way.
Either we were going to do it either way. I just didn't know in which format we were going to do it. And so it obviously went the way it went. And so I had to start getting ready a sermon series on the book of Daniel. So I'm 4 weeks into it, and there are some really interesting things coming out of it that I want to pick your brain about.
And now, maybe you should say something about Daniel for the mainline Protestants that didn't know it was in the Bible.
That's an interesting point. So I realized in doing my prep that I had not preached from the book of Daniel. Oh, we got fun graphics now. I had not preached through the book of Daniel in almost 20 years from when I was evangelical and believed deeply in biblical prophecy and futurism. So I knew this would be a very different enterprise to go through it now. So here's a background story that I wanted to tell you. In 2007, I had been the pastor of a church in upstate New York, and in a denomination where you're not required to have a master's. So I only had a biblical studies degree. And culture was changing so much in that mid 2000s, post 9/11, with postmodernism coming in, and just the generation behind me being so different. I could tell that they were just asking different questions and concerned about different things. And I really wanted to go back and get a seminary education. Okay. So in 2007, I flew out to Portland, Oregon, and attended a Len Sweet event because I had listened to his Napkin Scribbles podcast. And so I went to George Fox Seminary for this event and decided that that's where I wanted to go to seminary. So in 2008, I stepped down from being the pastor at the church in Saratoga, and my wife and I went to stay with her parents in Montana for the summer so that I could read and study and get ready to go to seminary because, Tripp, I was a little self-conscious that because I had been out of school for that long, that I was going to go into my seminary education as a remedial student. I would be so far behind that I would like embarrass myself. So
You needed to get your groove back.
yeah, I knew that scholarship had changed a little bit and that there was a bunch of stuff that I just wasn't aware of, partly because I had this friend named Danielle Bailey, who was the head at Skidmore College. She was the head of the InterVarsity Fellowship, and she had just graduated from Roberts Wesleyan University, and she knew a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know. And so I was feeling a little intimidated. So I spent the summer in Montana getting ready for seminary. Well, in typical Bo fashion, I overdid it. I so over prepared and overshot my landing spot that by the time I actually started in the fall, I had like deconstructed so many things and had migrated theologically so far that I ended up entering seminary at a completely different plane than I had left that spring in New York.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So you're going one direction and Lynn Sweet's going the other.
Exactly. You know what? That's true. And I never studied with him. Once I got there, I had passed by that exit on my journey, and he was in my rear view mirror by then.
Yeah. Yeah. At some point, remind me to tell you a funny Lynn Sweet story.
Okay. Yeah, he's a real character, man.
Also just jealous that he has a perfect color of gray hair and it stayed long and thick.
He has a mane.
I know. My hair, lockdown happened, it just starts thinning. I feel like an old loser. I turned 40 in lockdown. I'm like, oh, I got to avoid death. And then I'm like, I'm going to be healthy. I lose plenty of weight. Hair just keeps falling out. I'm like, I take some weird vitamins. They don't help. Alicia's like, you don't need, it doesn't matter. You don't, resist the demand for perfection, blah, 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 all these kind of things. And I'm like, they make medicine for this. She's like, you're not, like, don't you feel like you would judge yourself if you were vain enough just to take a medicine that you don't really know the long-term impact to have more hair? Like, there's nothing about things that matter to you and I'm like, well, that might be the case, but I really like my hair. And now I don't. And,
thank you, Jesse Torrey. That's a very nice comment. Hey, by the way, I want to give a shout out. You remember our friend Rebecca Burnt?
Uh-huh.
So she posted a funny thing the other day about how she figured out why guys in their mid-30s and 40s start growing beards. And it's to cover up the skin. So I found this funny meme, the Instagram meme, about a guy deciding whether to shave his beard or not. So do you want to look younger and worse or better and older? Because he had gray in his beard. And I sent it to her about beards. And then she wrote back and mentioned that she had listened to our post-election, what do they call it? The post-mortem or whatever. And that it was good stuff. But I just want to give a shout out to Rebecca Burnt and say that my memories of hanging out with you are some of my most favorite memories. And whether it was at a big conference like Solarize or when we were up in San Francisco for AAR, or whether it was just hanging out at the coffee shop, I just wanted to say that I'm so grateful. Oh, we met a couple times in Portland, but anyway, it was just really, really cool to reconnect with her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she came to Edinburgh while we were there, like after lockdown and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and then her and Alicia left most of the day and did fun things. So I was like, all right, I guess I got ditched.
Tripp, you may get a little background noise here. I have a snow blower outside my office window, so it may get a little noisy for a second.
I'll survive. All right.
Okay.
So you You overdo your
I
prep
did it.
for theological education.
And so one of the things I discovered that summer that I had never known about in my all of my pastoring experience as an evangelical, I had never heard of the phrase literature of the oppressed. And it was possibly the most fascinating thing about the Bible that I learned in that preparation season, which is that there are certain books in the Bible that were written when the people of Israel were under occupation or in captivity. And so they developed a pretty clever writing style, which is to speak in coded language so that you can say what you want to say, but then have plausible deniability. And because you didn't say like down with Rome, but you had an apocalyptic vision of say the stars falling from the heavens and the city on 7 hills being destroyed, and it was a clever way of disguising what you really wanted to say when you weren't free to, because they didn't have First Amendment protections.
Yeah, they didn't have First Amendment. Could you imagine what Roman imperial censorship would look like if they had the digital surveillance system of our current situation? This is why First Amendment protections, I think, are really important in the present, because the last thing we need to do is feel the need to only speak in code.
Yeah,
that's a regression.
Can I tell you an interesting thing about living in southern Idaho? Is that politically,
lots of potatoes.
That's true. Politically, progressive types like me and folks that are concerned about things like social justice and other, liberal leaning convictions, when we meet at a coffee shop or a pub, it's interesting. People start to speak in hushed tones. So both in Los Angeles and in Portland, you didn't have to do that. But here, when you are talking about certain political items, it's interesting that people, they lean a little closer and they talk a little softer, because even, the wait staff or your people at the next table, and it really took me aback when it first happened. I was like, why are we whispering?
They're like, this guy just said UBI. Universal Basic Income. That is the gateway to Satan. Gotta spit in his avocado toast. That's what this they have a side of the menu that's just like, if they order from these items, they've already located their politics.
Yeah.
Avocado toast. So I'm feeling very giddy today. You're just gonna have to talk over me.
Okay.
This might be a side effect of enjoying this twice as much because I'm sitting in my ice fishing tent.
All right. Yeah. By the way, the optics, I know that a lot of people listen to this as the podcast, but for those who are watching on the live stream, the optics of you sitting in that tent are pretty cool, man.
Oh, that's the encouragement I need, Bo. It's the encouragement I need. It cuts the volume of the birds down a little bit too.
Yeah. Yeah, we could hear the birds last week.
All right. You're going to tell us about prophecy.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop interrupting you for 2 minutes.
No. It's good. It's all good. Plus the snow blower just took another pass, so it was perfect timing.
Oh, okay.
So let's get in the book of Daniel. I want to walk you through a couple things, because the book of Daniel really comes in 2 parts. The first part is like narrative stories, and then the second part are sort of interpretations of dreams and apocalyptic predictions. Okay. So I am reading this. Oh, somebody thinks you're hotboxing. It sort of does look like that, though.
Well, And plus the little video thing behind our heads looks like smoke's moving around. That's why I clicked it.
You're right. So in Daniel 1, we start with a story about resistance and resilience. And so this is why I am loving reading the book of Daniel through this new hermeneutical lens that I've acquired in the last 20 years, both through things like the literature of the oppressed, but also what we're going to talk about a little later with the preterist interpretation of prophecy. So we started with Daniel 1, and Daniel and his buddies, they've been given new names because they're in captivity in Babylon, and the setting is in the 600s BC. That's when the captivity would have been. So, Tripp, one of the things I did, and I want to play this game with you too. What's your favorite movie or TV show that is set in a different time than it was filmed?
Oh, Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, that's a good one. No one said that one so far. People have come up with things like Forrest
It's the
Gump.
greatest TV show. You said
love
TV
Battlestar
show.
Galactica?
You didn't say film.
No, you could be a movie or TV show.
Oh, well, then Lord of the Rings.
So far, here's the ones.
Shirt on.
Oh, you do have a Gandalf shirt on. Here's the ones that people have come up with so far. Oh, look at that. So my favorite answer so far, films like Back to the Future, Mad Max, which apparently was set in our current year.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious. Gone with the Wind, John Wayne movies, which is actually there's a theological thing going on there too. But TV shows like This Is Us and the 70s show. So people have come up with really good answers. But I think that this question of the difference between when Daniel is set, its plot, and its actual writing, according to scholars, that the difference between when it's set and when it's written is really, really instructive. Star Wars, there you go. Nice, Jesse. So, if the setting is in Babylon in a captivity, in a land far away, in a time long, long ago, right? That's different than writing to address the current situation, which is not a captivity in a faraway land, but is a military occupation in your own land. And so if the later writing of Daniel was in, say, the 200s BC, in that intertestamental period, you have a very different context, and you have to think of like the Maccabees and where we get our celebration of Hanukkah from is that the siege, right, and that the lamps only had enough oil for one night, but they lasted 8 nights, right? It's a very different context than a captivity in a foreign land, which is to be under occupation in your own land. Okay? So when we get into Daniel 1, the story is that Daniel and some of the other educated elites of the Hebrew nation have been taken away, and they're supposed to eat the foreign diet. But Daniel, in an act of resistance, says, hold on, give us 10 days. Let us do a trial period. We're only going to eat vegetables and drink water, and then compare us with the other young men in the court, and you'll notice that we're going to be sharper, and we're going to be, our appearance will be brighter, everything will be better. So the interesting thing is that the experiment works. And by the way, Tripp, did you ever do the Daniel diet?
No. Why would I?
Do you know about it?
I know about it just because people made jokes about it on the internet. And I recently read this article that was like on weird things from the Bible that then became like evangelical memes, like Daniel diet, the prayer of Jabez, like
the
these
prayer of
things where you're just
Jabez?
like, what in the world is, where did this come from? And it requires you to have like a really high biblical authority, but also know almost nothing about the Bible. Where then you're
Yeah,
like, well, obviously I'm going
yeah,
to extend my territory. And
yeah,
finally I learned like the real weight loss plan.
yeah.
Um,
Jesse says that Christian vegans use it as a case for the Genesis diet.
ooh, I mean, I guess it would be early Genesis, right?
Yeah, early Genesis.
Yeah,
Before things get wonky.
yeah. Nah, no, we're guys on a podcast, so we actually support the carnivore diet. I think that's what
Yeah.
what our niche is supposed to do here, Bo. We're like, look, if you give us 10 days and all we eat is steak, we're gonna be in ketosis. And those we're gonna dominate for the Lord.
So in Daniel 1, the takeaway, this is why I love this hermeneutical lens, okay? This interpretive lens. Tripp, a lot of people read the Bible in different ways depending on where they're at in their spiritual journey. So some people like to read the Bible literally. They try to read it as literally as possible. It's a little tricky because not everything's meant to be taken literally, but to read the parts that are meant to be literal, they try and read them literal, okay? And other people read the Bible sort of more historically. They do a lot of their work behind the text. And then some people read the Bible devotionally. And it's like the point of every story is, what does God want me to do? What am I supposed to get out of this? Right? It's all about application. You like to point out that in the early centuries of the churches, allegorical reading was one of the most popular. But here's the thing. One of the reasons I love this book of Daniel right now is that because of this thing of the literature of the oppressed, that it was set 600 years BC, but it was probably written 200 years BC, is that all four of those ways of reading the Bible sort of come to the same point or conclusion. So, for instance, with Daniel chapter 1, whether
So
you're
it's like
trying to read it,
hermeneutical alignment.
yes. So whether you're trying to read it literally or you're reading it devotionally or you're reading it historically, doing the work behind the text, you come to the same conclusion. Why is the author of Daniel telling us this story in chapter 1? And the application, the takeaway is exactly the same. It's don't compromise, don't give in, and don't give up. Be faithful to your God because God is faithful to you, right? So don't give up your convictions. Don't compromise your standards. Don't give in to their ways and their culture. Stick with what you know. God will prove you.
You know what's fascinating about that is, I mean, the Jewish people, one, mark themselves distinctively, right, by what you consume, dietary laws and these kinds of things. But and it both serves like a identity purpose.
Yeah.
But you also get, like, I think it's in Ezekiel where you're like, oh, well, you're supposed to eat the text, eat Torah, right?
Yeah.
So there's also the ways that what you consume, um, is functions as a metaphor in Scripture. The first Psalm 1, right, is a similar analogy, like the Torah is where you plant your roots, right, as a tree. So there's there, but what's fascinating about the food analogy is this observation that Daniel's making, that what pollutes you is what you put in,
Mm.
and um, and I think that's a really important framework. It's obviously true for our bodies, um, but I think it's also true for, soul, consciousness, or
Yeah.
whatever way you want to talk about your interiority or your subjectivity. Like, what you put in is what pollutes you, and that's a
Mhm.
place to think about being distinctive or faithful.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
content you consume, I think, connecting what we talked about last
Yeah.
time, like the
Yeah.
algorithms that you let mediate your
Yeah.
relations with people can pollute you.
Yeah.
And the the assumption in Daniel is that the habits and patterns that are normative in that culture for what you consume are things that are to be contested, and that one of the distinctiveness of the people of God is that by attending to what you consume, you actually become a better resource for the well-being of the whole of society.
Yeah.
And so, but he doesn't do it in this kind of prescriptive way. Let's make everyone do exactly what we want. It's let our faithfulness by attending to what we consume demonstrate
Yeah.
the nature,
Right?
character of God and what it looks like in in their context.
So good. Now, it happened that my first sermon in this series happened to be the week before the inauguration, our most recent presidential inauguration. And it gave me an opportunity to say to my audience, hey, be careful what you eat and drink this week. Like don't eat your feelings and numb yourself with your beverage. Like, don't give in, don't give up, stick with your convictions, right? Like, eat healthy, make sure, even with if you use an analogy, right, of your news consumption, right? So both in literal food, but also in metaphorical or allegorical sense.
But what about after the kids go to bed? See, this is a different.
All right, so then we get into chapter 2. And in chapter 2, the king Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he's deeply troubled by this dream. But he does something really funky, which is he knows that his court, if he tells them his dream, they're going to provide an interpretation. So he puts a litmus test out and says, you have to both tell me the dream and the interpretation. And that way I know I'm not getting bamboozled. You're not going to pull the wool over my eyes by just giving me an interpretation after I tell you the dream. You have to tell me the dream first to qualify to give me. And this, I have not read this story in 20 years. And I had so many funny memories because in my evangelical charismatic world, when we talked about prophecy, we often meant personal prophecy. So we would invite people after the service to stay behind for a time of prayer, and we would often get words, prophetic words for them, right? Now, at the time, my BS sensor wasn't as finely tuned as it is now. And
Your Bo
because
Sanders sensor?
That's good. That's good. Because I was so desperate to hear the word of the Lord, that the moving of the Spirit, I would give the benefit of the doubt to prophetic words, like until proven otherwise. Now, I had a friend who's still one of my best friends who hated these prophetic words because he had so many bad experiences when we were in college. And he just told me one a couple weeks ago where every time he would go forward for prayer, and you're at a Bible college that preaches abstinence, and invariably the person who was praying for him would get a word that he struggled with lust.
A
And
safe guess for
that's what he would say.
Testosterone flying through a male at that age. You're like, oh.
So he would tell people, no, something else. Like, that's too easy. That's low-hanging fruit. You could just assume that about anybody who's in this chapel right now. Give me something so I know this is real. I just think that's a really funny story. But I will always remember one time when I lived in upstate New York, afterwards, I was praying for a young woman who was visiting, and she actually had come to the service because she had heard that things like this happen at our place, because we really believed in the moving of the Spirit. And she asked for prayer, but she wouldn't tell me what she wanted prayer for because she didn't think it was real, right? She was a little bit cynical, a little bit apprehensive about the whole thing. And so she did this sort of a thing. You have to tell me what the problem is first, so I know you're really hearing from God before you tell me the solution, right? Or whatever it was. And so I knew that it was on and that I really better be open to whatever Holy Spirit was going to reveal, because I don't mean cynical in a bad way. I mean suspicious or, skeptical.
You didn't go, you should not put the Lord your God to the test.
Come on. Tripp, you are really fun at this game because you know your Bible well enough that you can make sassy comments like that. That's pretty funny. So, I ask if I can hold her hands so I can pray. And when she puts her hands in mine and I close my eyes, and on the back of my eyelids, I see this painting. And it's like a family tree sort of thing, but the roots are exposed. And on one side of the tree, there's like a rabbit hole or a burrow on the left side. And so I described to her what I'm seeing. And when I open my eyes, she's staring at me. And she says, "That's the painting that hangs over the fireplace of the person that I am here about." So here's why I bring this up. At the time, I had a very different metaphysic than I have now. I had never encountered process thought at the time, and I was working off a charismatic, cosmology, where I thought that God was up in heaven, which was like a different realm, and that God's spirit would like beam down messages, and that if you were tuned in to the right signal, you could get these messages. That was my sort of metaphysic at the time. Oh no. He said, yeah, I won't read that comment. But I've always held on to that memory because, Tripp, one of the things that even when you deconstruct, one of the things I've never been interested in is debunking my own experiences, right? I want to hold on to my experiences, even if I grow to view them differently and interpret them differently. But I never want to discount my experiences. I actually want them to be a part of my spiritual formation, right? And my theological journey. I feel bad for people who, a lot of us have things we're embarrassed about in the past, but I don't want to wholesale write them all off as I was deceived or I was brainwashed or whatever. I want to sort of hold on to them and see if I can repurpose them or, upcycle them into something else. So when I learned about process, I sort of tweaked, my metaphysics and updated my cosmology. And now here's what I think happened in that encounter. I think she was holding this picture from her. It was at her family house that she was raised in. And the person, her grandfather that she was thinking of, had this picture above the frame, and it was their family tree. I think she was holding that memory in the cells of her body, in her brain tissue. And that when I was holding her hands, that because of the interconnectedness, right? And especially of intention, that I was able to, and I think you would use the word prehend. I don't know if I'm using that right, but I was able to see what she was seeing. I don't know if that makes sense. So I no longer think that this broadcast originated in some other realm and that it was beamed to me because I was tuned into the right frequency. I think that in the sacredness of that connection, in that moment of vulnerability, that I was open and she was open, and that I was able to see what she was concerned about. So I passed the test like Daniel did so that I could tell her what was the problem. And that way she knew that whatever was coming next wasn't BS. That makes sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a very cool story. And Daniel earns the king's trust. And but he also uses it because the king was ready to kill the other guys. And Daniel, because he didn't have a zero-sum political view, he didn't say, okay, protect me and my friends who worship the one true God and kill those other guys. He actually said, you don't need to kill anybody, save those guys. And so, because he had a non zero sum approach to relational, societal, political, religious allegiances, he, by his faithfulness, he also saved, quote unquote, the other guys. It's a genius story.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jesse mentioned internal relations as a place where process thought kind of would think about this. The one way you might talk about it different is, when you talked about, oh well, these memories exist in her body or in her brain or whatever. Those are still that's still language trying to describe knowledge or memories as if they're substantial and
Okay.
stored.
Okay.
The doctrine of internal relations, or the way Whitehead imagines prehension, is that when you move beyond a vision of substances, right, where this individual possesses this other individual possesses this, and now like God is intervening to kind of connect the dots, so you're
Right.
aware to it. If you switch to becoming, if you switch to relations, then in every moment of becoming, everything, the many things that happened before are showing up in a moment. And part of what, if all the events prior are showing up in any one moment of becoming, then how one is attuned to that moment of becoming brings to consciousness the web of relations between you, her, both of y'all's past, and all these kinds of things. And so by opening oneself or becoming attuned, things that are always present can come to consciousness. And so it's a kind of attunement or a kind of attention. And that kind of worldview, one, does what you see the king doing here, like recognizing that part of the fabric of existence are these kind of relations, that they are genuine and real. And so you see it in the text, but it's also in our modern context a rejection of the individual as a buffered self, and the only access you have to that person's interiority experience and such is if they give you access to it, like they're not just a black box, right? And that
Oh, that's
seems
awesome.
so different in our own
Yeah.
context because of reductive materialism wants us to be a black box of our own experience unless we share it. It also is similar to the logic that your true self and no one else has access to it unless you share it, right? Like
Yeah.
these kind of black box, autonomous, substantial, hyper individualism. When that vision of the world becomes how you narrate your own story and such, then these kind of experiences are hard to make sense of. And
Wow.
oftentimes, when you deconstruct the interpretive framework for that experience, then you go like, well, what do I do with it? Right?
Yeah.
Like I obviously had this experience, but
Yeah.
now if I see the world, beyond a single kind of mythopoetic structure, like what,
Yeah.
and that experience doesn't fit in the
Yeah.
rationalist materialist one, what do I do with it?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons that I find, like you mentioned earlier, like your your account of the world should include everything you've at least experienced.
Yeah.
um, and in doing so, uh, our metaphysics should, ultimately gets a little weirder than an empirically funded description can
Wow.
manage all on its own.
Dude, that was awesome. I'm so glad that I'm telling you these stories. That was fantastic.
I know we talked about this before, but like, that time I cast out a demon.
Yeah.
And it's similar, but like an inverted one where I realized that the person I'm talking to has this whole other world view. And I'm like, this is not the time, right, in that pastoral moment to go like,
Yeah.
metaphysically, I find this problematic. And
Oh my
and
gosh.
and so like just deciding to occupy it, right?
Yeah.
Like to sit there and go, "Oh, let me tell you what I think's really happening." But
Yeah.
if you kind of join that structure, but
Yeah.
with the integrity of your own perspective, then you can facilitate something that wouldn't have happened if you were like, "Nope, your worldview's wrong, so I can't acknowledge your experience." And
Wow. Wow, wow, wow.
why I said that, Josh, who's in the chat, recently posted his interview with Pete Rollins, where he brought up the funniest conversation I've been in the car for, where you and Peter Rollins got an argument about how you cast out demons. Y'all, we're I don't remember, we're driving around Los Angeles going to maybe a concert or something, and
We
Pete
were
and
headed
you,
down to Temecula.
okay, there you go. And you and Pete are like, "No, you gotta do a power exorcism," and he's like, "No, you gotta
Pete
learn the demon's name," and
Pete
y'all
was
are,
sticking up for power encounters, and I was trying to persuade him to do truth encounters, but he wasn't buying it.
I don't I just I would all I know is that it was one of the funniest things because I had no idea what you 2 were talking about. And it was clear that you both have very different interpretations of it, but you're like, "No, no, no, no. Let me tell you how this really is." And I just, I'm just sitting there like,
Oh
"What is
my
going
gosh.
on?" It's like when you were like, "The preterist." I'm like, "I don't know, but this is probably like a power exorcism versus a truth one."
Wait, so Pete brought this up when he was talking to Josh?
Well, Josh does this, podcast format, which Josh, I nominate Bo to do it. It's called 20 Questions, and there are these
Oh,
20 questions one night while Josh and I think, are Zooming late at night while sharing beverages. I'm like, "This would be funny." Like, you ask these 20 questions
yeah.
to random people, and they nominate someone else to do this, and they're half funny and half, you know,
Okay.
serious-ish, and they blend, and Pete, but he was like, "Oh, I'm talking to Pete," and I was like, "Oh, ask him about the funniest thing about he has a hot take on how you're supposed to do, exorcisms." And then I also was like, "Ask him about uh, his multiple year long lie to Elgin that he had sheep." Because
Yeah,
Elgin, was
that was
little
funny.
when they first when he moved to LA, he lived with us for a bit, and then years later moved in with him. Then he moves out, and we're at that parsonage, and uh, but yeah, but he, Elgin was just like, Irish people are like Shaun the sheep, so they all have sheep, and Pete just showed him pictures off Google Image. I was like, "Oh yeah, here's my sheep," and I'm like,
Yeah.
anyway, sorry. You're
Fun. That's
good.
fun stuff.
Joshua's now gonna have you on. And,
Awesome.
it
That's
I'm
fun.
kind of excited about it.
That's
Maybe
so fun.
he's probably working right now, but it'd be hilarious for you to do it on TNT just so I don't even have to talk that much. I can just sit here and smoke while he asks you the 20 questions.
Let's do it. That sounds great. All right. So Daniel chapter 3 is the famous story about the fiery furnace,
Oh, yeah.
right? And
Got
so
some cool kid songs about this one.
yes, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not bow to the idol. They get thrown into the fiery furnace. The king, who's very disturbed by this whole thing, peers in, sees a fourth character in there, which is a guardian angel, and and they come out. They don't even smell like smoke, right? So this is a fantastical story, right? I mean, it's just an amazing, amazing story, and some of the takeaways for me were the obvious about not bowing to idols, right? This is like core to whether it's the 10 commandments or so many passages in our New Testament about not bowing, having idols, right? Now, one of the funny things is I grew up in the 80s as an evangelical. And we in youth group were constantly told not to bow to idols. Like whatever our friends were really into, we weren't to compromise and bow the knee to any other thing, other than God and God's ways. And we even had a song, I think it was by a band like DeGarmo and Key, called I'm Not Gonna Bow to Your Idols, that we would sing. It may have been Petra, but I think it was DeGarmo and Key.
Well, I mean, it's easy to get them confused.
But this was a really big theme. Now, in our current political moment, Tripp, the irony is that that group that raised me makes the evening news daily for idolizing, right, and compromising and bowing the knee to this political power. And I got to be honest, like, it brought up something really visceral in me. This not going to bow to your idols thing. And so that was a fun one to preach because it's the same as Daniel's diet in chapter 1. The takeaways are the same. Don't compromise. Don't give up. Don't give in. Be faithful to God, who will be faithful to you. Now,
one of the things about that, like just thinking back to what you talked about in chapter 1, right? If the food element is about intentional about what you consume, bowing is it being intentional about how you orient one's life or how you give one's allegiance or place one's trust.
Yeah.
And so that's like the internal, an internal form of resistance, resilience, distinctiveness for the people of God consumption. And an external one is how you orient, how you give allegiance, where you place your trust.
Wow.
And and you can see how both the stories, they're literal,
Yeah.
ones like in one sense, like they're literal, like this is a way of doing this, but they also function in those other senses, metaphorical and analogical ways about consumption and orientation. And the interesting thing about it, and you tell me what you think because you've obviously spent more time with Daniel recently. But one of the things that's fascinating about those texts are there's clarity about the problem. Like they recognize they are not at home in the domination system where they're living, but they also are not like escaping to have cutting off relationship of to the whole system, right? They're not like cloistering or cursing it in its totality. It in some sense, it's like by attending to what you consume and how you orient, you're able to stay in relation with a culture of the domination system while staying faithful to God.
Yeah.
Um, and in the kind of intentionality that those texts are bringing to the fore, I think become a real helpful framework, right? Because it's not as if there's not implicit criticism of the domination system that's there. It's but the the kind of assumption in Daniel is not like, oh, well, let's take it over and put the right people in charge so that the authority is doing this, this, and this, are making our law and vision normative. It's how do we have a community in exile that that is connected to our neighbors and the systems that are there while being distinctive, and the distinctiveness is how one, what one consumes and how one orients.
Yeah. Boy, this if I had it to preach over again, I think I would really focus on the embodiment, right? The actual enfleshment, the enactment of your convictions and orientation, belonging and loyalty, with your physical body, right? That it's not just about abstract concepts and mental um, theories, but it's about what you do. All right.
Yeah, and part of it is, right, like, in that context, this is before the kind of enlightenment transformation of the notion of faith to do you assent or not assent or pass the true false test of
Yeah.
beliefs, like, where faith isn't about conceptual beliefs, but faith is about trust, orientation. Faith is about how you give one's finitude in the world. And so it creates a different way of thinking, like what faithfulness is, right? Like you don't feel like your faith is being challenged and undermined by the presence of other beliefs, because beliefs in some sense are secondary to the faithful orientation of oneself and community.
Wow.
And you, like, when these texts get picked up by a Protestantism that is, resentful or critical of dominant culture, but thinks that faith is about beliefs, then you become combative over truth, as opposed to, militant about one's faithfulness.
Man, this is good stuff. All right, so in Daniel chapter 4, we have another dream, but this one's different because the king is open about the imagery from the vision, and his guys can't interpret it. But Daniel, who has now a reputation and credibility to interpret, he gets to interpret it. And here's the problem, though. It's bad news. It's about the king being brought low and humbled and losing everything, right? So Daniel, as the prophet here, has to speak truth to power. Now, he does it. The interpretation actually becomes true. The king goes out and lives like a wild animal, right? Sleeps outside, gets dew on him. His hair grows long like eagle feathers. His nails grow long like eagle claws. And he's out of his mind, right? And some people think it's like a werewolf story, like lycanthropy. But other people think it's like an emotional or mental breakdown. Whatever it is, the king comes back and he humbles himself and gives glory to God and is converted. A king is converted, okay? So here's the thing, why the difference between the setting and the timing of the writing is important. If these events took place in 600 BC, okay, in captivity, that's one thing. And that's an amazing story of a king being converted to a different religion. Because I don't know if you're aware of this, but rulers, they have a slippery relationship with religion. This is, by the way, why you need a prophet, a priest, and a king, because the king's relationship to religion can be quite tricky. They often try and get out of the religion what benefits them and their power and authority and glory. And so you can't trust the relationship between, say, a monarch, a ruler, an authority, and the religious establishment of the day, because the religious establishment sometimes will compromise and get in the king's pocket. And so you can't really trust a king's relationship to religion or the religious establishment's relation to the powers. This is why you need a prophet. It has to be the prophet, priest, and king. So sometimes the prophet has to speak truth to power. And so he does it here, and the king is converted. It's a miraculous story. Now, if these events happened in the 600 BC, that's one thing. But if this book was written in the 200s, why is this story included? And my theory is that it's not about Nebuchadnezzar in a long time ago in a land far away. Tripp, this is the funky thing. You ready? It's a story about a dream that the king had, but the intention of the telling of the story is to spark in us the dream of kings converting. So it's a story about a king's dream, but really it's to inspire us dreaming differently about the kind of kings we can have.
That's funky. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar.
So if you think about this, this would have been written around in with the Alexander the Great, right? And that empire. And then that transitioned obviously to the Roman Empire that we know in our Christian Testament. But for both Caesars and for rulers and kings, to inspire the people of God. So I'm really viewing Daniel almost as a handbook of resistance and resilience. And so if you think about it to be something that both trains and inspires, say, the young people, let's say the Maccabeans, to resist and to be faithful in the hopes of kingdoms falling, rulers changing, and even overcoming the powers that be. So I think it's a pretty funky story.
Yeah, and in some sense, right? Like it's tending to that dynamic of consumption and orientation that is ultimately compelling to the monarch, which is it becomes the witness of the people of God that makes it compelling, which which is I think is different than um, in our own context. Like, oh, let's instead of converting this kind of conversion of the monarch, it's a let us seize monarchical control and enforce um, enforce our worldview and value system on the populace.
All right, so in Daniel chapter 5, we get a new king, Belshazzar. And this is the famous story. You know the saying, the writing's on the wall? You know, he could read the writing on the wall?
Yeah.
It comes from this, Daniel chapter 5. So the king throws a banquet. The hand of God writes on the wall, "You've been measured and found wanting." And so that's where I am this week. So this coming Sunday, that's what I'm going to be talking about, is this fantastical story about the very script of God saying, "Hey, buddy, I've put you on the scale. You've come up wanting. You're a lightweight, and I'm getting rid of you." So I'm not quite sure what direction I'm going to take it yet, but I'm going to have a lot of fun with this idea that the writing is on the wall. You don't have to be a prophet sometimes to see the future. Sometimes it's obvious for all to see, right? The writing's on the wall. That's where that saying comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you do with it when you see it becomes the variable, right? Like the sense that you can see writing on the wall, and then hypothetically, let's say you were a part of a political party and you see the writing on the wall, and then you're like, well, I guess that means we capitulate. Or perhaps you see the writing on the wall and you're like, oh well, let's just donate a large amount of money to this king's library and not protect the infrastructure of the fourth estate news media. Or there, like, sometimes you see the writing on the wall in the present moment of the claims for sovereignty from the monarch. You see the writing on the wall, and in the short term you capitulate, and that's different than seeing the writing on the wall and reorienting one's allegiance. So like you can, I mean, there's so many ways where people can read the same thing, recognize what it's saying, and then you interpret what faithful response is really differently. And that's why that's why I think that dynamic of consumption and attention helps you orient what you do with the reality when it's seen. When you're if your habits of consumption and the way you orient yourself, say maybe towards power as opposed to towards fidelity, the same writing can lead to a host of different responses.
All right. So that very night, Belshazzar is out. We get a third king, King Darius. King Darius's cabinet talks him into making a decree that everyone has to bow and worship. Daniel and his buddies don't. So this is the famous story of Daniel in the lion's den. And this is about political conspiracy and persecution, and not being afraid of the consequences of staying faithful and resisting. So that sermon is basically going to preach itself, right? But we're going to do a fun twist. I have this kids Bible, the Sparks Story Bible. That's a cartoon kids Bible.
Oh, yeah. No, we use it every night.
Yeah, we give it away to every family in our church, and we make it available to everybody who comes into this building.
There are very few good children's Bibles.
That's true.
And I'll say that that same series, the Psalms book they make, I absolutely love it. It is my favorite kids Bible. And it's just Psalms that are translated in a way, kids can understand the emotional valence of the Psalm. And at night, I'll get Cora and Haven to pick the one, that matches their experience. So it's like the Psalms in this for, translated in a way for kids, allows them to share their own experience of God using the words of the people of God. At the end of the day, it's an amazing book. Anyway, I will say the new Bible for Normal People, Kids Bible, I just got it in the mail yesterday that they did a big Kickstarter thing for, and it's excellent.
Oh, good. I'll have to check that out.
It's for a little more, more like older elementary type, but yeah.
Cool. So in the kids study Bible, there are only 2 stories from Daniel. One is the fiery furnace, and the other one is Daniel in the lion's den. And I have this theory that we love teaching stories to our kids in Sunday school, any story in the Bible that has an animal in it. And these are stories we have to be especially careful of, because often we learned the story as a kid, as a child, and many of us have not circled back and developed a non-childish understanding of the story. So I often joke with people that Jesus said we're to have faith like a child, but not a childish faith. So any story that has an animal in it, like Jonah and the big fish, right? And Daniel in the lion's den, Noah's Ark. We love stories with animals in it to teach our kids, but many of us don't go back later and rework to understand what's the theological lesson that we're supposed to get out of it if we're not a child. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually preaching from the children's Bible. I'm going to have the kids in the church read us the scripture with the images being up on the screen, and I'm actually going to preach it from the kids' Bible, but in a non-childish understanding. It's going to be pretty fun. So that's it. You have Daniel in the lion's den. And then the book of Daniel changes. So when you get into Daniel 7, it goes away from the narrative stories and it starts getting into these prophecies. So there are 2 last things I want to run by you, Tripp. First thing, in Daniel chapter 9, you have this prophecy of the 70 weeks. And it's a famous riddle about 77s or 7-year periods, or right, and how you interpret that. When I was really, really into Bible prophecy, one of the distinctions between me and many of my peers is that I thought that the prophecy in Daniel 9 of the 70 weeks was a messianic prophecy, not a futuristic prophecy, that it wasn't about the end times, that it was actually fulfilled in Christ. Okay? And I was so sold on this that I actually developed a wall chart of the 70 weeks to help people understand that hundreds of years before Jesus, that the cross was prophesied, and that what the work of what God did in Christ was actually seen hundreds of years before and outlined for us, and that we can count down in it even gets to the point where the final week, the 69th week, is split in half. So it's not a 7-year period, but it's cut in half. So that's 3.5 years. And I thought that was Jesus's earthly ministry, the 3.5 years. right? Like I was so into it. But the funny thing is, bro, I couldn't convince anyone to go with me in this interpretation.
So this wasn't like a normal one in your tribe. This is like
No.
this is OG BS material.
Yeah, yeah.
Bo
And
Sanders material.
I had found some pamphlet or whatever that had got me thinking this way, and I was convinced, and I would actually take the time to pull the staples out of the pamphlet and to Xerox it page by page, and then reassemble these pamphlets and hand them out because I truly thought that it explained. And it meant a lot to me because if Jesus fulfilled this prophecy, then we can trust God. Right? Like the takeaway is God knows the future and we can trust God. God has plans and God reveals those plans. Does that make sense? So during this 2007 and 8 deconstruction, when I was getting ready for seminary, one of the things that I realized is that if you hold that these prophecies are apocalyptic and about the end of the world, you read the Bible very, very differently than if you view them as messianic interpretations that point to Jesus. And that the difference between believing that Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy or that they were about current times in the future led you down two very, very different paths, and that your Christianity actually looked very, very different because you weren't looking to things like modern day Israel or the Russian Empire or, right, the wars in the Middle East, because you thought that these prophecies were already satisfied in Christ. But it wasn't until 2010 when I was sitting in a diner in Claremont, California, with Philip Clayton across the table from me. And I was talking with somebody about this sort of a thing, and he introduced me to the concept of the preterist. Preterists are a group of people that think that all the prophecies of the Bible, everything Jesus was talking about, like even the destruction of Jerusalem, was all fulfilled in that first century. The destruction of Jerusalem and the conversion of the Roman Empire satisfied all biblical prophecy. Once I was introduced to just the idea of preterism, I was never the same, because while even from my left behind tribe, right, the LaHaye and Jenkins Left Behind series, they were all reading that. And I never got into it because I thought that they were fulfilled in Christ. But once I knew about the preterists, it honestly released me from even the expectations that things had to be fulfilled either in the first century or they were about the future. Like once I had that framework, I was able to just see biblical prophecy and apocalyptic literature in a completely different way, and it really lost its grip on me. I no longer was concerned about, say, history being written before the foundations of the world, or even a God who knew the future, right? And this is during the heyday of the open and relational. So this was open theism, was controversial back in 2010. But once I realized that there was even this thing called preterism, even though it's a severe minority perspective, it released me from even being concerned about open theism and the argument about God knowing the future. And it was weird. It's like once this one thing, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back, right? It was the final moment of me trying to hold on to this tension and make sure that I was interpreting scripture correctly in that way. It just set me free to view scripture and prophecy and history in a completely different way. So it's going to be interesting when we get to Daniel 9 and we get to the 70 weeks. It's going to be interesting to see sort of what I want to do with it or how deeply I want to engage it. Because I'm going to be honest, Tripp, in the early 2000s, it was a major fascination of mine.
Do you think the shift there was one about how you see maybe God's sovereignty in relationship to history?
Yeah.
Because I think, a lot of times the different interpretations, or, more of like hearing students when it comes up, those kind of mapping of history on prophecy things, they experience God's relationship to history as if the whole thing is written and settled, right? Kind of, C.S. Lewis uses the image of a book, right? Like, we feel like we're at some place, like a cursor moving through the text or a finger moving as you read the text. But in reality, the whole thing was already written. And when people have that problem, Ty, sometimes, you defend your particular interpretation because in defending it, you're really defending the ability to trust God amidst the flux of history, right? Because, well, it's already been written.
Yeah.
And there, the vision of the divine that secures things is that the entirety of it has already been authored and settled. And I think one of the shifts that in open and relational theologies broadly is that the sovereignty of God is not set from the outside of a story settled at the beginning, but the sovereignty of God is expressed by God's present fidelity throughout it. Like, God has refused to be God without us and is with us in the midst of each and every history. And I think the way Paul describes that, what that hope looks like, is that, God is faithful until sin, law, and death have been brought into the divine life through the Son, and eventually God becomes all in all, right? So all things that are identifiable are identified within the very life of God, like this kind of deep participation. But that shifts the metaphor of sovereignty from a closed book to kind of like God as, Abba, as they're like with us, holding our hand, and in the future, God will be there, is what we're trusting. And so, as opposed to a book, it's really like, collaborative live improv, except that the one who is with us, guiding us, is like the one who's refused to be God without us. And I like to use the image of a flashlight, right? So, like, because of the divine presence and guidance, lure, whatever way you want to use it, like, if you are facing the unknown, is your security that the story's written, or the one who's going to be with you through it, right? And obviously there's more knowledge about what's immediately available to us, like the light of a flashlight, but you don't have to erase the fact that there's unknown mystery and darkness in the future, because you're secure, because God has demonstrated God's sovereignty by embracing us, embracing the world, embracing Sarks, and will be faithful, right? Even to death on a cross. And so you can say, oh, where could we go to escape the love of God that is in Christ Jesus? And I think the affirmation of the resurrection is like, you can get your ass all the way down to Sheol and you can't do it. Right. And so, like, that, what is the sovereignty of love is the one, God with us, God for us, and God before us. And is such a different dynamism. And what's funny though, right, is when that gets set aside and you start to think in that open relational framework and then look back at these texts, it makes perfect sense that that's exactly what's being described, right? We tell the story of this other time, right? And then go, where God was faithful, and it's precisely that God was being faithful with us. And what is that? What is a response of faith to God's faithfulness look like? Well, it's what you consume. It's how you orient yourself. And then when you're doing that, it could
Yeah.
It could convert a monarch. It could create solidarity and witness to the living and life-giving God in the midst of a furnace, or whether you're chilling with, lions, right? And it's like all those images take up a completely different framework
Yeah.
when that much more relational biblical vision of the divine
Yeah.
fidelity
Yeah.
it shows, gets reworked.
That's well said, man. And it's interesting, like for me, once that final card fell, it it was just a free for all. So, like for instance, I moved from a substance based metaphysics to a relational understanding,
Praise
and
the Lord.
little things like instead of calling God Almighty, through reading The Weakness of God by Caputo, I moved away from the almighty conception of a divine monarch to a relational one of the most related one. You know, I mean, it was it was weird once that
Which is a
final
Marjorie Suhaki line, by the way, for
yeah,
nerds that want to go find it. God Christ Church, Marjorie Suhaki, the most related one.
yeah. So it's weird when so Pete Rollins talks about to bring it full circle. Rollins talks about sometimes really sincere people. I think this is in the fidelity of belief, but I don't know. Or fidelity of betrayal.
Yeah,
I think
that's
that's what
right.
it's called.
Fidelity of betrayal.
So I sort of over believed in biblical prophecy, right? And future telling. Uh, I wasn't just your normal sort of adherent that thought, well, God knows the future and this is about the end of the world. I sort of got too far into it and I over believed. In fact, I pressed so hard into interpreting biblical prophecies, especially through a messianic lens, a Christological lens. I pressed so hard into it that I actually popped out the other side. I like overdid it. And once I emerged on the other side, I just realized there's an entire ecosystem and landscape on the other side of the limitations of that view of history and sovereignty. And I mean, I don't even know how to describe what I became. This sort of open-ended, constructive approach, you know, generous orthodoxy, irenic, conversational, relational thinker. You know, I totally transformed. So it's one of the reasons that I rarely returned to Daniel is because I have a little bit of scar tissue built up from over believing it.
Well, you know what the poets Red Hot Chili Peppers say about scar tissue?
No.
You don't?
No.
Hey, man, did you really live in Los Angeles? I feel like Red Hot Chili Peppers are like one of the bands that are like so Los Angeles. They're on more radio stations there than
So,
other places. Like
Tripp,
scar
I have a
tissue that I
little bit
wish you saw, sarcastic Mr. Know It All. That song.
Tripp, I have a little bit of hipster in me, and when too many people are into something, I get a little allergic to it.
All
I get a
right.
taste aversion.
All right. Well, I'm just saying you might want to go to Spotify and do the like greatest hits of Red Hot Chili Peppers
Okay.
because they got a vibe. They got a vibe. Plus, big Laker fans.
Okay. Last thing I want to tell you. I want to talk about this dating of Daniel because I think this is fascinating. So
He
in that
dated.
what?
He dated. It was a joke. The dating of
He
Daniel.
is dating goodbye.
Like
What?
after you do the Daniel diet, next it's like Daniel dating.
So in that
We learned in the
2008
fiery furnace he was not a fan of Tinder. Oh,
Wow. So in that 2008-2009 window, I had an iPod that I had to sync with my computer to get new podcasts to download. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to was um, a, a biblical backgrounds podcast out of Duke University.
other than homebrewed Christianity.
Yes, I did love Homebrewed back then. Those were heady times there. So I would listen to this, and we get to Daniel, and I'm so excited as we go through the Bible to get to Daniel, because as I've said, it meant so much to me, but I was growing a little confused about, like, what do I do with it? So he's walking through and he's talking about how they date Daniel. And one of the reasons that so many scholars lean towards a later writing of Daniel's authorship is found in Daniel 11:30. This gets really interesting. So Daniel is prophesying how these battles are going to go, the change of empires and the battles. And so some biblical scholars think it's too spot on. It's too on the nose, and that for being prophetic, it was too exact, too accurate, until you get to Daniel 11:30, when he talks about the ships that launch on the sea, and he's referencing a branch of what we know as like the Greco-Roman, but the Greek Empire, called the Seleucids, and they were a seafaring people. And it's in Daniel 11:30 that they arrive on the shores of Egypt. And the author of Daniel thinks that the battle is going to go one way, but he gets it wrong. And it actually the other way. And this is why this is how we can date the writing of Daniel, is this is where he goes from having a 100% record in his predictions, right? Which is a little suspicious anyway, that it's that accurate. And then he finally gets something wrong. So that must be the moment that he was writing in and didn't know how the battle went. So that's one of the ways that they try and date the writing of Daniel. And once I heard that, I realized, hold on. Prophecy in this way is not the same as I was told it was, right? Writing the end from the beginning. The prophecy happens in the moment, right? There's a prophetic moment where the prophetic imagination says, here's how we got here, here's where we are, and here's how we could go. I think this is really timely for our moment, because there are a lot of people right now, Tripp, with what's going on in our country and in our globalized society, that are trying to predict the future. And it's going to be interesting, because there are some people that say this too shall pass, that the system of the courts is the perfect check and balance to what's happening right in our government. And though this will be the largest test that democracy has ever encountered, it will hold, and we will sail through this storm. But there are other people who are trying to predict the future and say, no. This is the beginning of totalitarianism. This is how we get to this, right? The place that we feared, right? And with the new Holocaust and the new world wars and the new regimes. So I just think that it is instructive if Daniel 11:30 is that moment when you stop knowing how things went, and the prophetic imagination is to take over at that point and say, here's how it could go. That's very different than future telling, because I'm hearing a lot of predictions about the future right now, and I honestly don't know what to do with them. Am I supposed to stay faithful, stay steady, stay calm, and sail through this storm, and that the institutional checks and balances, right, will hold? Or is this the disintegration and the end of the democratic experiment? And we live in that moment.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you think of that, that hinge, right, where it's describing what's happened, where the flux and flow of history it's being described, but then the engine of it, right, is the alternative perspective of Daniel, right? That there actually is energy, divine energies at work, present and at work, amidst that history. And here's what faithfulness looked like in our past history, in a sense being described in the story. And so like everything that's happened up to that point in Daniel it remains instructive about what faithfulness looks like in a history where you really don't know what will happen.
Yeah.
And that shift I think is really important, because
Yeah.
if one's security is knowing the future, that's one way to resolve anxiety, but it's not one. It's different than managing the way you relate to a future that your agency your agency escapes really guiding. Then like, what do you do with your own agency, and what do you do as the people of God with your agency? Everything up to that point in the book is describing what that looks like.
Yeah. I will always remember Philip Clayton shooting a video in where the tectonic plates met in this like canyon, and talking about punctuated equilibrium as a view of history, that the tension builds and builds and builds until the plates slip. And that's when violent, catastrophic change happens. And I adopted, because of Philip, the punctuated equilibrium view of cultural tension in history. And we live in one of those moments where we don't know if the tension is going to hold and that these are just rumblings, or if the plates are truly going to shift. And this is going to be tectonic change and violence and radical realignment, right? So that punctuated equilibrium is the moment we live in.
Ooh. Plus, punctuated equilibrium just sounds cool.
Right.
And I'm more familiar with that than preterism. or Daniel's
hey, it's
Tinder.
another P. We got another P.
Oh God. Yeah, there's just gonna be a lot of P's. Of P's.
We
should do that again. We should do the vocab thing again.
I agree.
Remember Jesse made all those cool graphics for it.
Jesse Turi was my artist partner, and he did great things. I'm actually working on one right now.
He's the elder of graphical sweetness, by the way.
The elder of graphical sweetness.
That was his title. Awesome. His title. It's ontological status.
I'm developing one right now called the 26 for 25. So it's the 26 letters of the alphabet, but things that are really pertinent for 2025.
Oh, this is fun. I want to do this. I want to do this for
you want in?
Yeah, this sounds fun.
All right, let's do it. I will send you my I'll send you my rough draft next week.
Okay.
All right.
26 for 25.
26 for 25.
It's catchy. And when you get 26, you can get a lot in there,
That's true. Like, I'm thinking about A used to be for atonement, but I'm actually thinking about going apophatic.
Oh, yeah, you would.
And especially because there's this awesome Pete, who's the comedian? Pete Holmes?
Yeah, Pete Holmes.
Quoting Barry Taylor.
Yeah.
About how God is a word blanket that we lay over the mystery to give it shape.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to do apophatic as my A instead of atonement. But then I got to figure out how to circle back around and get some atonement in there later.
Well, you could just do it for B, blanket.
All right. Well, I'm gonna come up, but P, we'll have to have some way to decide. We already have, from this podcast alone, we have 5 P's.
Yeah. I mean, it's overwhelming. Just such a loaded letter.
Yeah. Well, Tripp, thanks for letting me tell you about this Daniel thing. I've been on such a journey with this thing, and I'm enjoying it so much. It is fascinating to return to a text that used to mean so much to me, but which has fallen into the dustbin, and to bring it back out and to repurpose it and clean it up a little bit. Josh says N is for non-shitty atonement.
Yeah, because there's a number of ones that maybe their contextual valence has dissipated over time.
I was gonna go B for better atonement, but that's already taken.
Yeah, and then we have to talk about golf clubs.
Yeah.
See, look at that Scott McKnight reference.
Hey, thanks everybody for tuning in today and for how lively the chat has been.
It's fun.
It is fun.
All right, Bo. This has been good. I'm looking forward to the 26 and 25.
That's our new project.
Yeah.
All right.
And then we can try to see if we can talk Jesse into making us some letters.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And then Josh is going to join us and you're going to do the 20 questions. That's going to be fun. We've already volunteered.
This has been a very productive session.
Yeah. All right. I got to go pack a lunch for kids.
All right.
But this has been fun. Thank you all for hanging out. And we'll see you again soon.